June 5, 1944. 10:47 p.m. RAF Tempsford, Bedfordshire, England. Flight Lieutenant David Harper sat in the briefing room of a base that didn't officially exist, preparing to fly a mission in an aircraft that wasn't on any registry, to drop men who would die without ever having their service acknowledged by the nation they were about to die for. Around him, 11 other pilots studied maps of Normandy, memorizing drop zones that would be critical to the success of D-Day, the invasion scheduled to begin in less than 8 hours. But these pilots wouldn't be mentioned in any history books. Their squadrons had no official designations. Their aircraft bore no markings. Their missions would never be declassified. They were the Ghost Squadron, phantom air crews flying phantom planes in support of operations so secret that even decades later, veterans would die without being able to tell their families what they'd done in the war. Harper's hands trembled slightly as he studied the route that would take him deep into German-occupied France, knowing that if he were shot down, his existence would be denied, his family told he'd died in a training accident, his sacrifice erased from official records because the operations he supported were too sensitive to ever acknowledge. This is the story of the Ghost Squadron, of the shadow war fought by air crews who volunteered to become invisible, and of the terrible price paid by men who agreed to die as ghosts so that others might live as heroes. It's a story about the operations that decided the war but couldn't be mentioned for 50 years, about courage that went unrecognized because recognition would have compromised security, and about the hundreds of aviators who made the choice to serve in absolute secrecy, knowing their contribution would never be acknowledged, their names never honored, their existence never confirmed. To understand the Ghost Squadron, you must first understand the shadow war that created the need for invisible aircraft and phantom air crews. By 1943, the Allied High Command was planning Operation Overlord, the massive invasion of Nazi-occupied France that would open a second front in Europe and begin the liberation of the continent. But Overlord's success depended on factors beyond simple military might. It required deception, intelligence, sabotage, and resistance operations that couldn't be conducted openly. The Special Operations Executive, known simply as SOE, had been conducting clandestine operations in occupied Europe since 1940, inserting agents, supplying resistance networks, conducting sabotage, and gathering intelligence. But SOE's operations required something the regular RAF couldn't officially provide: aircraft and crews willing to fly highly irregular, extremely dangerous missions that violated conventional military doctrine and had to remain completely secret. The solution was the creation of what would later be called the Special Duties Squadrons, though during the war they had no official designation at all. Based primarily at RAF Tempsford and RAF Tangmere, these squadrons operated a mixed fleet of aircraft, Halifax and Sterling heavy bombers, Lysander and Hudson light aircraft, even captured German planes for particularly sensitive operations. The aircraft were modified extensively, stripped of most defensive armament to save weight, painted matte black to reduce visibility at night, equipped with specialized navigation equipment and drop gear for parachuting agents and supplies. Most distinctively, they carried no squadron markings, no identification numbers, nothing that could link them to official RAF operations if they were shot down or captured. David Harper had volunteered for this duty in the autumn of 1943, after completing a tour of operations with Bomber Command over Germany. He was 24 years old, from a small town in Yorkshire, the son of a schoolteacher who'd raised him alone after his father died in the First World War. Harper had joined the RAF in 1940, trained as a pilot, been assigned to bombers, and flown 30 missions over Germany before being given the choice to complete his service or volunteer for special operations. Most pilots chose to complete their tour and return to training duties or staff positions, anything to get away from the nightly grind of flying into flak and night fighters. But Harper had volunteered for the Ghost Squadron because a recruiter had explained that the work was essential to winning the war, that it saved lives by supporting resistance operations, and that it required pilots willing to work in absolute secrecy without recognition or glory. The missions Harper flew between October 1943 and June 1944 were unlike anything in conventional warfare. He would take off from Tempsford after dark, fly at low altitude across the English Channel and deep into occupied France, navigate using only maps and dead reckoning since any radio transmission could give away his position, locate a drop zone marked only by a handful of flashlights held by resistance fighters, and parachute agents or containers of weapons and explosives with precision that required flying at 300 feet at night in hostile territory. Then he'd turn around and fly home, hoping German night fighters and anti-aircraft guns hadn't detected him, hoping the resistance fighters on the ground had received their cargo safely, never knowing whether the agents he'd dropped survived or were captured, never learning what operations his supplies supported or whether they'd succeeded. The stress was extraordinary. Bomber crews at least flew in formation with mutual support, had gunners to fight back against attackers, operated at high altitude where they had some room to maneuver. Ghost Squadron pilots flew alone, unarmed except for a single machine gun for the co-pilot, at altitudes where any mistake meant instant death, over territory where every German soldier was looking for resistance activity and had orders to shoot first and investigate later. The survival rate was terrible, worse than Bomber Command's already horrific casualty figures. Of the original pilots who'd formed the Ghost Squadron in 1941, fewer than 20% survived the war. Most died in crashes when they hit unexpected obstacles flying at night. Some were shot down by fighters or flak. Others simply disappeared, their aircraft lost over the Channel or the French countryside with no trace ever found. But the operations were essential. The weapons and explosives dropped by Ghost Squadron aircraft armed resistance fighters who sabotaged rail lines, disrupted German communications, and gathered intelligence about German defenses. The agents parachuted into France coordinated these resistance networks, transmitted intelligence back to London, and would prove critical during D-Day by directing resistance forces to disrupt German reinforcements attempting to reach the beaches. Without the Ghost Squadron support, the French resistance would have been far less effective, D-Day would have been more costly, and the war might have lasted significantly longer. But none of this could be officially acknowledged because revealing the existence of the operations would compromise methods and sources that were still in use. On June 5, 1944, Harper and his fellow Ghost Squadron pilots received their most important briefing ever. D-Day was scheduled for the following morning, and they would fly multiple missions throughout the night, dropping agents and supplies at locations throughout Normandy and Brittany to support resistance operations that would begin as soon as the invasion started. Harper's specific mission was to drop 3 SOE agents near Cannes, carrying new radio equipment that would allow them to coordinate resistance attacks on German reinforcement routes. It was a straightforward mission by Ghost Squadron standards, a known drop zone, experienced reception committee on the ground, relatively short flight time compared to missions deeper into France. But something felt wrong. Harper couldn't articulate it, couldn't point to any specific intelligence or warning, but his combat instincts were screaming that this night would be different. The Germans knew something was coming, reconnaissance had reported increased Luftwaffe patrols, more aggressive flak responses, signs that German intelligence suspected invasion preparations even if they didn't know exactly when or where. Flying into France on the night before D-Day meant flying into a hornet's nest of German defenses on highest alert. Harper's aircraft was a Halifax Mark V, designation irrelevant because it wasn't officially assigned to any squadron. His crew consisted of 5 men, a co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and 2 dispatchers who would handle pushing the agents and supply containers out when they reached the drop zone. All were volunteers for Ghost Squadron duty, all knew the risks, all had signed documents acknowledging that their service would never be officially recognized. They took off from Tempsford at 2,247 hours, joining a stream of other Ghost Squadron aircraft heading for various targets across northern France. The flight across the Channel was routine, the night dark enough to hide them from visual detection. Harper kept his Halifax at 800 feet, just high enough to clear any unexpected obstacles, low enough to stay under German radar coverage. The co-pilot, Flight Sergeant Thomas Mills from London, maintained the navigation plot while Harper flew. Behind them, the 3 agents prepared their equipment, checking parachutes and making final adjustments to the radios and weapons they were carrying. They crossed the French coast at 2,331 hours, Harper identifying the landmarks that marked his route despite the darkness. The navigator called out checkpoints, verifying they were on course, calculating the precise time they'd reached the drop zone. The radio operator monitored German frequencies, listening for any sign that their approach had been detected. For the first 30 minutes over France, everything was quiet. Then the flak started. Not the random defensive fire that Ghost Squadron aircraft sometimes encountered, but concentrated, accurate anti-aircraft fire that suggested the Germans knew exactly where Harper's Halifax was despite the darkness and low altitude. Shells exploded around the aircraft, close enough that Harper could feel the concussion, bright flashes lighting up the night. He took evasive action, jinking left and right, climbing and diving, trying to throw off the German gunners' aim while maintaining enough control to stay on course toward the drop zone. "They're tracking us," Mills shouted over the intercom, his voice tight with controlled fear. "They've got our altitude and bearing. They're not shooting blind." Harper knew what that meant. The Germans had some kind of radar or detection system that could track low-flying aircraft, something that intelligence hadn't warned them about, something that made every Ghost Squadron mission suddenly far more dangerous than they'd calculated. He had to make a decision: abort the mission and return to England, or continue to the drop zone and complete the objective despite the flak and the certainty that the Germans now knew he was there. The three agents in the back of the aircraft made the decision for him. The lead agent, a French woman using the codename Mathilde, came forward and told Harper to continue. "The mission is too important to abort. Get us to the drop zone. We'll take our chances on the ground." Harper nodded, appreciating her courage even as he questioned the wisdom of continuing into what was clearly a trap. But she was right, the mission mattered more than any individual aircraft or crew. He pushed the Halifax forward, dropping even lower to try to get under the flak, the altimeter showing 500 feet, then 400, dangerously low for night flying. Over unfamiliar terrain. They reached the drop zone at 0017 hours on June 6, 1944, D-Day had officially begun, though the soldiers on the beaches wouldn't land for another 5 hours. Harper could see the flashlight signals from the Resistance Reception Committee on the ground, confirming this was the right location. The dispatchers opened the jump door, the wind screaming into the aircraft. The agents moved to the door, ready to jump. And then the night exploded. Tracer fire arced up from multiple positions around the drop zone, German machine guns firing at the Halifax, the reception committee ambushed or compromised or possibly never having existed in the first place. Harper realized with sick certainty that this was a trap, that the Germans had known about this drop, that someone had betrayed the operation or the resistance network had been penetrated. "It's compromised. They're waiting for us." Mills shouted unnecessarily. Harper could see the tracers, could feel rounds hitting the Halifax's thin skin, could hear the terrifying sound of bullets punching through aluminum. Mathilde, standing at the jump door with tracer fire visible below, turned and looked at Harper. Even in the darkness and chaos, he could see her expression, determination mixed with resignation, the look of someone who'd known this might happen and had accepted it. She saluted, a military salute that acknowledged Harper's role in bringing her this far, and then she jumped. Her two companions followed immediately, their parachutes disappearing into the darkness toward the German guns. Harper didn't see if they survived the landing. He was too busy fighting to keep his dying aircraft airborne. The Halifax had been hit multiple times, the port inner engine on fire, hydraulic fluid streaming from severed lines, the controls sluggish and unresponsive. Mills was slumped in his seat, blood spreading across his uniform from wounds Harper couldn't see. Behind them, someone was screaming, one of the dispatchers hit by the machine gun fire. "We're going down," the navigator shouted. "Can't maintain altitude." Harper fought the controls, trying to gain enough altitude to clear the tree line ahead, but the Halifax was too damaged, too heavy, falling despite maximum power from the remaining engines. The trees rose up to meet them, and Harper's last thought before impact was that his family would never know how he'd died, never know what he'd been doing in the war, never understand that he'd volunteered to become a ghost so that others might be remembered as heroes. The Halifax hit the trees at 200 miles per hour, breaking apart on impact. The cockpit section separated from the fuselage, tumbling through the forest, disintegrating with each impact until it finally came to rest against a massive oak tree that had stood in that French forest for 300 years and would continue standing there for decades after the war ended. Harper was unconscious, trapped in the wreckage, badly injured but alive. Mills was dead, killed in the crash. The 3 other crew members in the rear section were also dead, their bodies scattered through the wreckage. Harper woke to German voices, torches sweeping through the wreckage, soldiers searching for survivors or intelligence materials. He tried to move, couldn't, realized he was pinned in the wreckage. He could hear the Germans approaching, knew that capture meant interrogation, that the Gestapo would want to know everything about Ghost Squadron operations. He reached for the pistol in his shoulder holster, thinking about using it on himself rather than being captured, but his right arm was broken and trapped and wouldn't respond. Then different voices, French voices speaking quietly, quickly. Resistance fighters, possibly the same reception committee that had signaled the drop zone. They'd waited until the Germans moved away from this section of wreckage, then approached Harper's position. They worked quickly and quietly. Using tools to pry open the twisted metal, extracting Harper from the cockpit, carrying him away from the crash site before German reinforcements could arrive. Harper drifted in and out of consciousness over the following hours and days. The resistance fighters hid him in a barn, brought a doctor, a veterinarian actually, but someone with medical knowledge who could set Harper's broken bones and treat his injuries well enough to keep him alive. They told him that Mathilde and her 2 companions had been killed in the ambush, shot by the Germans as they landed. They told him that other Ghost Squadron aircraft had been shot down that night, that the Germans had apparently penetrated multiple resistance networks and set traps. They told him that D-Day had begun, that Allied forces were on the beaches, that the invasion everyone had worked toward was actually happening. Harper spent 6 weeks hiding in that barn, recovering enough to walk, while Allied forces fought their way inland from the beaches. The resistance network moved him several times as German security sweeps came close to discovering him. They forged identity papers listing him as a French farm laborer, coached him on a backstory that might hold up under casual questioning, warned him that if he were captured and identified as an RAF pilot, the Gestapo would be particularly interested in what he'd been doing flying an unmarked aircraft into France. By late July 1944, American forces had advanced far enough that Harper's resistance contacts were able to deliver him to American lines. He was debriefed by U.S. intelligence, who seemed confused about who he was and what he'd been doing. His aircraft wasn't on any loss reports, his squadron wasn't in any registry, there was no official record that he'd even been flying that night. Eventually, British intelligence officers arrived, verified his identity through codes and procedures that proved he was genuine Ghost Squadron, and transported him back to England. At RAF Tempsford, Harper learned the full scope of what had happened on the night of June 5 to 6, 1944. 17 Ghost Squadron aircraft had flown missions into France that night. 8 had been lost, shot down or crashed, with only a handful of survivors. German intelligence had indeed penetrated several resistance networks in the weeks before D-Day, had learned about planned drop operations, and had set traps. But the missions had still succeeded in their larger purpose. The agents and supplies that did get through provided critical support for D-Day operations. Resistance fighters armed with Ghost Squadron supplies had disrupted German communications and reinforcements, and the overall deception and intelligence operations had contributed to the invasion's success. But Harper and the other Ghost Squadron personnel would never be recognized for this contribution. The operations remained classified, the squadrons officially didn't exist, the losses couldn't be acknowledged. Harper was presented with paperwork stating he'd been injured in a training accident, spent time in hospital, and was now being medically retired from service. His time with the Ghost Squadron was erased from official records. The medals he'd earned could never be presented because presenting them would require explaining what he'd done to earn them. The comrades who died flying missions that never happened would be listed as training accident casualties or simply missing, their families never told what they'd really been doing, their sacrifice never properly honored. Harper struggled with this for the rest of his life. He'd returned to Yorkshire, married, had children, worked as a mechanical engineer designing agricultural equipment. But the war haunted him, Not just the trauma of combat and the crash, which would have been enough, but the additional burden of knowing that his service couldn't be acknowledged, that his friends had died for operations that officially never happened, that their contribution to winning the war would never be recognized because recognizing it would compromise intelligence methods that remained secret decades after the war ended. In the 1970s and 1980s, as Cold War tensions thawed slightly and some World War II secrets began to be declassified, Harper tried to get official recognition for Ghost Squadron operations. He contacted the Ministry of Defense, wrote to members of Parliament, lobbied veterans organizations. He was met with official denials. There was no such thing as Ghost Squadron, the aircraft and operations he described weren't in any records, his claims couldn't be verified because they hadn't happened. The few other Ghost Squadron survivors faced the same official stonewalling. The British government simply refused to acknowledge that these operations had occurred. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, 50 years after the war, that the Official Secrets Act's time limits expired on some of the Ghost Squadron documents. Historians researching SOE operations discovered references to aircraft missions in support of resistance operations, found casualty figures that didn't match official RAF loss reports, located photographs of aircraft with no markings or identification. Slowly, painstakingly, researchers reconstructed what the Ghost Squadron had done, documented the missions and casualties and contribution to the war effort. By then, Harper was 75 years old. Most of his fellow Ghost Squadron veterans were dead, and official recognition came too late to matter for most of them. The RAF formally acknowledged the Special Duties Squadrons in 1996, published a brief history of their operations, and included them in official honors and memorials. Harper was invited to a ceremony at RAF Tempsford, which had been closed since the 1950s and was now a historical site, where a memorial was dedicated to the aircrews who'd flown missions that officially never happened. Harper stood in front of that memorial, reading the names of pilots and crew members who died in crashes and shootdowns that hadn't been acknowledged for 50 years, and he thought about Mathilde, the French agent who jumped to her death knowing it was a trap because the mission mattered more than survival. He thought about Mills, his co-pilot who died in the crash. He thought about the hundreds of resistance fighters who died because their networks had been penetrated, who'd been betrayed or simply unlucky, who'd fought and died without recognition because acknowledging their service would have compromised ongoing operations. The official history that was finally published described the Ghost Squadron's contribution in careful, factual language. Between 1941 and 1945, the Special Duties Squadrons had flown over 2,500 missions into occupied Europe, dropped 1,200 agents, delivered 10,000 tons of weapons and supplies to resistance networks, and suffered over 30% casualties, 295 aircraft lost, over 1,400 aircrew killed or captured. These operations had been essential to SOE's success, had supported resistance movements that tied down German forces and gathered intelligence that shaped Allied strategy, and had contributed directly to major operations including D-Day, Market Garden, and the liberation of concentration camps. But the numbers couldn't capture what it had meant to fly these missions, to volunteer for operations that couldn't be acknowledged, to accept that your service would be invisible and your sacrifice unrecognized. The Ghost Squadron aircrews had made a choice that most people couldn't understand, to serve without glory, to risk death without honor, to fight a war in the shadows where success meant you remained unknown and failure meant you died as a training accident casualty whose family never learned the truth. Harper understood something that the official histories couldn't quite articulate, that the Ghost Squadron represented a particular kind of courage that wasn't about facing the enemy in open combat but about accepting invisibility in service of something larger than personal recognition. The pilots who'd volunteered for these duties had been offered a choice: continue with conventional operations where your service would be recorded and acknowledged, or volunteer for special duties where your contribution would never be officially recognized but would be essential to winning the war. That hundreds of aircrews had chosen the second option, knowing they'd become ghosts, said something profound about duty and sacrifice that transcended the usual narratives of military heroism. David Harper died in 2003, age 83, having lived long enough to see the Ghost Squadron finally acknowledged but not long enough to see full declassification of all their operations. Some records remain classified even today, missions so sensitive that the British government still won't confirm or deny they occurred, operations that served purposes beyond simple resistance support and touched on intelligence methods and sources that remain active or relevant. The few surviving Ghost Squadron veterans who lived into the 21st century went to their graves carrying secrets about missions that can't be discussed, operations that mattered enormously but can't be detailed, and the knowledge that some service will never be fully acknowledged because doing so would compromise methods and people still at risk. The memorial at RAF Tempsford stands as a testament to the aircrews who flew missions the rest of the world never knew about, who volunteered to become ghosts, who accepted that their contribution would remain invisible. The names carved in stone represent only part of the story. For every name listed, there were others whose service still can't be acknowledged, whose missions remain classified, whose families still don't know exactly what they did in the war. These were the true ghost aircrew, flying planes that never existed on missions that never happened. Achieving victories that couldn't be claimed, dying in operations that couldn't be mourned. Modern Special Operations Forces understand something of what the Ghost Squadron represented, the necessity of invisible operations, the value of deniable missions, the strategic importance of maintaining secrecy even at the cost of recognition. But modern special operators at least know that eventually their service will be acknowledged, that memoirs will be published, that histories will be written. The Ghost Squadron veterans mostly died without that assurance, died knowing that their service might never be recognized, that they'd volunteered to become permanently invisible. As the sun sets over the English countryside where RAF Tempsford once buzzed with activity, where unmarked aircraft took off into darkness carrying agents and supplies into occupied Europe, where young men volunteered to fly planes that never existed on missions that never happened, a question remains: how many others served in similar capacity, in other wars, in other conflicts, flying missions that still can't be acknowledged, conducting operations that remain classified, dying in service that won't be recognized for generations if ever? The Ghost Squadron was declassified after 50 years, but only partially. Other operations remain secret. Other aircrews remain ghosts. Other families still don't know what their loved ones really did in wars that have been over for decades. And perhaps this is necessary, perhaps some operations must remain secret indefinitely, perhaps some service can never be fully acknowledged, perhaps being a ghost is a sacrifice some must make so that others can live in freedom without knowing the full cost of maintaining it. The planes that never existed flew missions that never happened carrying people who never landed, achieving victories that couldn't be claimed, and proving that sometimes the truest heroism is the kind that accepts anonymity as the price of serving something greater than glory, that understands sacrifice without recognition is still sacrifice, and that being forgotten by history doesn't diminish the value of service, it simply makes that service invisible to everyone except those few who knew, those fewer who survived, and those fewest who carried the secret to graves that bear no mention of the extraordinary things they did in a war the world thinks it knows but whose deepest truths remain classified, mysterious, and eternally guarded by the ghosts who served in shadow so others could live in light.